The bull couldn't hold back his emotions when embraced by his favorite human. Heartwarming ending. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and comment telling us where you're listening from. The auction yard at Wagga Wagga smelled of dust, sweat, and fear. Cooper stood in the holding pen with 40 other cattle, his massive black and white body pressed against the metal rails, his dark eyes watching the constant stream of farmers and buyers who walked past, assessing, judging, deciding which animals were worth their money and which weren't. At 6 years old, Cooper was past his prime for breeding stock, and the limp in his left rear leg from an old injury made him less valuable still. He'd heard the stockmen talking. If no one bought him today, he'd be loaded onto a different truck, one that didn't lead to another farm. Cooper had been born on a small property outside Tumut, raised by a farmer named Thomas Chen, who'd treated his cattle with respect and care. Thomas had named him Cooper after his own grandfather, and for 5 years, life had been good. Cooper had grown strong and healthy, had sired several calves, and had known the rhythm of seasons on the land. But Thomas had gotten sick, cancer they said, and within 6 months the property had to be sold. Cooper and the rest of the herd were dispersed, sent to various sales and auctions. That had been a year ago, and since then Cooper had been through 3 different properties, each one worse than the last. The current owner, a rough man named Dawson who ran a large commercial operation, had no patience for an aging bull with a gimpy leg. Cooper had overheard him talking to the stock agent that morning, his voice carrying across the yards. "Just get whatever you can for the old boy. He's eating feed I could be giving to productive stock. If he doesn't sell, send him with the others to the meat works." The words meant nothing to Cooper in terms of language, but animals understood tone, understood intention. He knew he was unwanted, knew his time was running short. Around him, the other cattle shifted nervously, their anxiety feeding into his own. A young heifer called out for her calf, already separated and sold. The sound was heartbreaking, and Cooper turned his head away, unable to bear it. The morning dragged on. Buyers came and went. They looked at Cooper, checked his teeth, examined his build, saw the limp, and moved on. One younger farmer, barely out of his teens, had stopped for a longer look. He'd run his hand along Cooper's shoulder, assessing the muscle there, but his mate had pulled him away. "Too old, mate. You need breeding stock, not a project." By early afternoon, the crowd had thinned considerably. Most of the good stock had been sold, loaded onto trucks and driven away to new homes. Cooper remained, along with a handful of other cattle that nobody wanted. The stock agent kept checking his watch, clearly eager to finish up and head home. Dawson had already left, not even bothering to see if Cooper sold. That's when the old ute pulled into the car park, its engine rattling in a way that suggested it had seen better days. A man climbed out, and even from a distance, Cooper could see he was different from the other buyers who'd passed through. He moved slowly, carefully, favoring his right side. His face was weathered and lined, but his eyes were kind, scanning the holding pens with genuine interest rather than cold assessment. His name was Jack Morrison, though Cooper wouldn't learn that until later. Jack was 73 years old, a retired farmer who'd spent 50 years working cattle on his family's property before his children had convinced him to sell up and move closer to town. But retirement hadn't suited Jack. He'd spent the last year rattling around his small house on the outskirts of Wagga, feeling useless and lost without animals to care for. His wife Mary had passed 3 years earlier, and his kids were busy with their own lives. The loneliness had become a physical weight. Finally, his daughter Sarah had made a suggestion. "Dad, why don't you get a couple of animals? Nothing major, just something to care for. You've got that 5 acres behind the house. It's just sitting there empty." Jack had resisted at first, but the idea had taken root. He'd started small, buying a few chickens, then a goat. But he missed cattle, missed the solid presence of them, the routine of checking on them each day. So he'd come to the sale yards, just to look, just to see if there was an animal that needed him as much as he needed purpose. Jack walked slowly along the pens, his experienced eye taking in each animal. He passed the prime stock without a second glance. Those animals would find homes easily. It was the others that caught his attention, the ones that buyers had overlooked. When he reached Cooper's pen, he stopped. Cooper was standing apart from the other cattle, his head lowered, that injured leg tucked slightly under him to take weight off it. There was something in his bearing, a dignity despite his circumstances, that made Jack pause. He'd seen enough cattle in his lifetime to recognize quality, even in an aging bull with a limp. "This one available?" Jack called to the stock agent, who hurried over, sensing a possible sale. "That's old Cooper, yeah, 6 years old. Got a bit of an injury to the rear leg, but he's sound otherwise." The agent's voice had that practiced enthusiasm of someone trying to move unwanted stock, owners keen to move him on. Jack climbed over the rails with a stiffness that betrayed his own age, moving into the pen. The other cattle shifted away nervously, but Cooper stood his ground, watching this new human approach. Jack moved slowly, talking in a low, calm voice. "Easy there, mate. Just want to have a look at you." He ran his hands along Cooper's side, checking his condition, feeling the solid muscle beneath the hide. He lifted the injured leg carefully, examining the old injury. It was healed but would always be there, a weakness that would never fully mend. Cooper stood perfectly still during the examination, something in him recognizing that this human's touch was different. There was gentleness there, respect. Jack stepped back, looking into Cooper's eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of two beings who'd both seen better days, who were both considered past their usefulness by the world. Jack had felt that way since retiring, since Mary had died. The look in Cooper's eyes mirrored his own loneliness. "I'll take him," Jack said simply. The stock agent blinked in surprise. "You sure, mate? He's not exactly prime stock. That leg'll always give him trouble." "I'm not exactly prime stock either," Jack replied with a slight smile, rubbing his own hip that ached constantly since the replacement surgery. "We'll get along just fine." The paperwork was completed quickly, the price laughably low. Dawson would be disappointed, but Jack didn't care about that. He cared about the fact that Cooper wouldn't be loading onto that other truck. Within an hour, Cooper was in the back of Jack's livestock trailer, being driven away from the sale yards and toward what would become his new home. The 5 acres behind Jack's house wasn't much compared to the vast properties Cooper had known, but it was well maintained, with good fencing, a solid shelter, and a dam that held fresh water year-round. Jack had spent the previous week getting it ready, though he'd told himself he was just being prepared, that he might not actually buy anything. But deep down, he'd known he would. The loneliness had become too much. When Cooper first stepped off the trailer, he stood for a long moment, taking in his new surroundings. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across the paddock, and the air smelled of eucalyptus and fresh grass. It was quiet here, peaceful. No shouting stockmen, no crowds of anxious cattle, no constant movement and noise, just space and silence, and this old man watching him with patient eyes. "Take your time, mate," Jack said softly. "No rush, this is home now." The first few days were an adjustment for both of them. Cooper explored every inch of his new territory, testing the fences, finding the best spots for shade, discovering where the grass grew sweetest. Jack visited 3 times a day, bringing feed, checking the water, just sitting on the fence rail and talking. He talked about his life, about Mary, about his children and grandchildren, about the years he'd spent farming. Cooper would come close, never quite touching, but listening in that way cattle do, his ears swiveling to catch every word. "You remind me of an old bull I had years ago," Jack said one evening, watching the sun set over the paddock. "Big old Hereford named Rusty. Had him for 12 years. When he finally passed, I bawled like a baby. Mary said I was being daft, crying over a bull, but she understood really. Sometimes an animal gets into your heart in a way that's hard to explain. It was on the 8th day that something shifted. Jack had brought Cooper's evening feed, pouring it into the trough as usual. But this time, instead of waiting for Jack to leave before approaching, Cooper walked up while the old man was still standing there. He moved slowly, his limp more pronounced after a day of moving around the paddock, and stopped just inches from Jack. For a long moment, they simply stood there, man and bull, looking at each other. Then Cooper lowered his massive head and gently pressed it against Jack's chest. The gesture was so unexpected, so clearly deliberate, that Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. His hands came up automatically, one settling on Cooper's broad forehead, the other stroking along his neck. "Yeah, mate," Jack whispered, his voice thick. I know exactly how you feel." From that day forward, they were inseparable. Jack's morning routine began with Cooper, checking on him, bringing fresh hay, just spending time in the paddock. His daughter Sarah noticed the change immediately when she visited the following week. Her father, who'd been slowly fading since her mother's death, who'd seemed to be just going through the motions of living, was animated again. He talked excitedly about Cooper, about the bull's personality, about the progress with his leg. "Dad, he's just a cow," Sarah said, though she was smiling, relieved to see her father so engaged with something. "Bull," Jack corrected automatically, "and he's not just anything. He's good company." Sarah watched through the kitchen window as her father went out to the paddock that evening. She saw Cooper immediately lift his head when he spotted Jack, saw the way the massive animal moved toward him despite the limp, saw her father's face light up with genuine joy. The bull lowered his head for Jack to scratch behind his ears, and even from a distance, Sarah could see the contentment in both of them. Winter came, bringing cold mornings and frost that painted the grass silver. Jack bought Cooper a thick rug to help keep him warm on the coldest nights, though Cooper seemed more interested in Jack's company than the weather. They developed routines, patterns that gave structure to both their days. Morning feed at 7, a midday check and chat, evening feed at 5 deers, and a final visit before bed where Jack would sit on the fence and Cooper would stand close, sometimes resting his head on the rail near Jack's leg. Jack's son Daniel drove up from Melbourne for a visit in July, bringing his 2 children. The grandkids, aged 7 and 9, were initially nervous around Cooper's massive size, but Jack showed them how to approach slowly, how to let Cooper sniff their hands first, how to scratch that spot behind his ears that he loved. "He's so gentle, Grandpa," the youngest said, her small hand barely able to reach the top of Cooper's head. "I thought bulls were supposed to be scary." "Some are," Jack admitted, "but Cooper here, he's special. He understands that we're all just trying to get by in this world, looking for someone who cares." Daniel pulled his father aside later that day while the kids were still petting Cooper. "Dad, I have to say, I was worried about you. After Mum passed, you seemed so lost. But this," he gestured toward the paddock, "this is good. You seem more like yourself again." "That old bull saved my life," Jack said simply. "After your mother died, I couldn't see the point of much anymore. But Cooper, he needed someone to care about him, and turns out I needed the same thing. We saved each other, I reckon." As the months passed, Cooper's leg improved with regular, gentle movement and good nutrition. He'd never be sound enough for breeding work, but he could move around his paddock comfortably, could trot to the fence when he saw Jack approaching. The limp was still there, always would be, but it didn't seem to bother him much anymore. The bond between Jack and Cooper deepened with each passing season. Spring brought new grass and warmer days, and Jack would sometimes bring a folding chair into the paddock, sitting for hours just watching Cooper graze, reading the newspaper aloud, even though the bull probably understood nothing of politics or sports scores. But Cooper would lift his head occasionally, as if acknowledging that he was listening, and that was enough for Jack. The local vet, Dr. Emma Thornton, became a regular visitor, checking on Cooper's leg and general health. She'd known Jack for years, had treated his cattle back when he was still farming, and she was delighted to see him so engaged with life again. "You know, Jack," she said during one visit, examining Cooper's leg with practiced hands, "I've seen a lot of human-animal bonds in my career, but this one is special. He trusts you completely. See how he's not even tense while I'm poking at his sore leg? That's because you're here, and he knows if you're calm, everything's all right." "He's been good for me too," Jack admitted, scratching Cooper's shoulder. "Better than any medicine the doctor could have prescribed." But life, as Jack had learned through 73 years, had a way of throwing challenges when you least expected them. It was a humid February afternoon when Jack felt the first sharp pain in his chest. He'd been filling Cooper's water trough, the summer heat making the work harder than usual. The pain was sudden and intense, radiating down his left arm. Jack dropped the hose, his hand going to his chest, and stumbled backward against the fence. Cooper, who'd been standing in the shade of the shelter, immediately lifted his head. Something was wrong. He could sense it in the way Jack moved, in the sharp intake of breath, in the fear that suddenly permeated the air. The bull moved as quickly as his injured leg would allow, crossing the paddock to where Jack had slid down to sit with his back against the fence post, his face pale and sweating despite the heat. "Not now," Jack gasped, fumbling for his phone in his pocket. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, and the pain in his chest was getting worse. "Can't leave him. Not yet." Cooper stood over Jack, his massive body providing shade, his head lowered close to the old man's face. His warm breath stirred Jack's hair, and he made a low, concerned sound deep in his chest. Jack managed to get his phone out, managed to press the emergency call button, managed to gasp out his address and situation to the operator. Then he let the phone drop and reached up with a shaking hand to touch Cooper's face. "Good boy," he whispered. "You're such a good boy." The ambulance seemed to take forever, though it was actually only 12 minutes. The paramedics had to enter the paddock carefully, wary of the large bulls standing guard over their patient. But Cooper, despite his size and strength, stepped back when they approached, though he didn't go far. He stood 10 meters away, watching intently as they examined Jack, loaded him onto a stretcher, and carried him toward the ambulance. Jack's daughter Sarah arrived just as they were loading him into the vehicle. She'd been called by the hospital and had driven at speeds she'd later not want to admit to. She barely glanced at Cooper as she rushed to her father's side, though Jack's first words to her were about the bull. "Sarah, you need to check on Cooper. Twice a day, morning and evening. Don't forget the evening feed he gets." "Dad, stop worrying about the bloody bull," Sarah said, though her voice was choked with tears. "Worry about yourself." "Promise me," Jack insisted, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll look after him." "I promise, Dad, I promise." Jack survived the heart attack, but the recovery was long and difficult. He spent a week in the hospital, followed by another 3 weeks of strict bed rest at Sarah's house in town, where she could monitor him constantly. The doctor was clear. No physical exertion, careful diet, regular medication, and absolutely no going back to living alone until they were sure he was stable. Meanwhile, at Jack's property, Sarah kept her promise. She drove out twice daily to feed Cooper and check on him, though she approached the task with dutiful obligation rather than affection. She was a city person, had been for 20 years, and while she'd grown up around cattle, she'd never developed her father's passion for them. To her, Cooper was just a large animal that needed feeding, but Cooper knew something was wrong. His person hadn't come back. The woman who visited smelled like Jack, sounded a bit like him, but wasn't him. She brought food and water efficiently, but left quickly, never staying to talk, never scratching behind his ears, never just sitting and being present. Cooper would stand at the fence long after she left, watching the driveway, waiting for the familiar rattle of Jack's old ute. Days turned into weeks. Cooper's demeanor changed. He ate less, moved around less, spent most of his time standing at the fence nearest the house, watching and waiting. Sarah noticed but didn't understand the depth of what was happening. She mentioned it to her father during one visit, trying to reassure him that she was handling everything. "Dad, the bull seems fine. Eating okay. Water's always fresh. You don't need to worry," but Jack could read between the lines. "He's not fine. He's wondering where I am. He thinks I've abandoned him. Dad, he's a bull. He doesn't think like that." Jack wanted to argue, to explain that Cooper did think like that animals felt abandonment and loss just as keenly as humans did. But he was tired, and the argument would only upset Sarah, who was already stressed from caring for him. So he stayed quiet, but the worry gnawed at him. It was Dr. Thornton making a routine check on Cooper, who finally raised the alarm. She examined the bull thoroughly, found nothing physically wrong, but recognized the signs of depression and stress. She called Sarah immediately. "Your father's bull is declining. Not physically, but mentally. He's grieving. I've seen it before in animals who lose their bonded companions. If something doesn't change soon, he could actually make himself seriously ill." Sarah called her brother Daniel that night, and they had a long conversation about what to do. Their father was stable, but still not strong enough to live alone, let alone care for a large animal. But the bull was clearly suffering from Jack's absence. It was Daniel who suggested the solution. "What if we brought Dad home, but I stayed with him for a while? I can work remotely, and Lisa and the kids could come up on weekends. Dad gets to be with his bull. We make sure he's not overdoing it. Everyone wins." It took some convincing, both of the doctor and of Jack himself, who didn't want to be a burden. But eventually, arrangements were made. 5 weeks after his heart attack, Jack Morrison came home. Daniel had arrived 2 days earlier to get everything ready, to stock the fridge and make sure the house was safe for a recovering cardiac patient. But he'd deliberately not told Cooper that Jack was coming back, wanting it to be a surprise. The old ute pulled into the driveway just after lunch. Cooper was in his usual spot at the fence, head lowered, the picture of dejection. He barely looked up at the sound of the vehicle, having been disappointed too many times when it turned out to be Sarah or Daniel instead of Jack. But then the car door opened, and Cooper's head shot up. He'd know that slow, careful movement anywhere, the particular way Jack favored his right side when he stood. The bull's entire body went rigid with attention, his ears pricked forward, every sense focused on the figure slowly emerging from the vehicle. It was him. After 5 endless weeks, it was really him. Cooper released a bellow that echoed across the 5 acres, a sound of pure joy and recognition that made Daniel jump and made Jack's eyes immediately fill with tears. The bull began moving toward the fence, his limp completely forgotten in his urgency, his massive body covering the distance faster than anyone had seen him move since he'd arrived. He reached the fence and stood there, his whole body trembling, making sounds deep in his chest that were half moo, half cry. Jack was walking toward the paddock, Daniel trying to slow him down, reminding him to take it easy, but Jack wasn't listening. He'd missed Cooper just as much as Cooper had missed him, had worried about him constantly during the long recovery. When he reached the fence, he didn't hesitate. He put both hands on Cooper's broad face, and the bull pressed forward, pushing his head against Jack's chest with such force that Daniel stepped forward, worried he'd knock the old man over. But Jack was steady, his arms wrapping around Cooper's massive head, his face pressed against the bull's forehead. "I'm sorry, boy. I'm so sorry I left you. I'm here now. I'm here." Cooper's entire body shuddered. If bulls could cry, Daniel would have sworn that's what was happening. The sounds the animal was making, the way his body shook, the desperate way he pressed against Jack as if trying to confirm he was really real and not another disappointment. It was the most emotionally raw thing Daniel had ever witnessed from an animal, and he found himself turning away, wiping at his own eyes, for several long minutes. They stayed like that. Jack talking softly, Cooper making those heartbreaking sounds, both of them trying to communicate across the species barrier that separated them, but also didn't, not really, because grief and joy and love were universal languages that required no translation. "I missed you too, mate," Jack whispered, his voice breaking. "Every single day I missed you. Couldn't stop worrying about whether you thought I'd abandoned you, but I'm back now, not going anywhere. You're stuck with me." Eventually, Jack's legs began to shake from standing too long, and Daniel gently intervened, helping his father to a chair he'd set up near the fence, specifically for this purpose. But Cooper didn't move away. He stood with his head draped over the fence rail, as close to Jack as he could get, occasionally releasing those deep, rumbling sounds that seemed to come from his very soul. Over the next hour, as Jack sat and talked to Cooper, telling him everything that had happened, about the scary hospital and the boring recovery and how much he'd wanted to come home, Cooper gradually calmed. The trembling stopped. The desperate sounds faded to occasional soft lows. But he never moved away from Jack's side, not even when Daniel brought out fresh hay and his favorite grain mix. "You need to eat, mate," Jack encouraged, gesturing toward the food. "Look, Daniel brought the good stuff. Come on, just a bit." Finally, as if only to please Jack, Cooper moved to the feed trough and began to eat. But every few bites, he'd lift his head and look back to make sure Jack was still there, still real, still home. That evening, as the sun set golden over the paddock, Jack's family gathered. Sarah had driven out after work, bringing dinner she'd prepared. The grandkids had come too, excited to see their grandfather back where he belonged. They all sat on the veranda, eating and talking, while Cooper grazed nearby, never straying far from where he could see Jack. "Dad," Sarah said softly, watching the bull, "I didn't understand. I thought you were just being sentimental, that he was just an animal. But seeing him today, seeing how much he missed you—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I get it now. This isn't just a pet. This is family." "That's exactly what he is," Jack confirmed, smiling. "Found each other at the right time. We did. Both feeling useless, both needing someone to care about. Sometimes I think I saved him from that sale yard, but truth is, he saved me right back. Gave me a reason to get up in the morning, something to care about besides my own problems." Daniel stayed for 2 months, and during that time he witnessed the daily routine between his father and Cooper. The way the bull would start moving toward the gate before Jack even appeared, somehow sensing when he was about to come out. The way Jack's whole face would light up when he saw Cooper. The long conversations Jack would have, sitting on his chair while Cooper stood nearby, listening with what seemed like genuine interest. The gentle way Cooper would take treats from Jack's hand, so careful not to accidentally catch his fingers with those large teeth. "It's like watching a friendship," Daniel told his wife on the phone one night. "Not a man and his pet, but genuine friendship. They communicate in ways I don't fully understand, but it's real. It's beautiful, actually." When Daniel finally returned to Melbourne, confident that his father was strong enough to manage with regular check-ins from Sarah and Dr. Thornton, Jack settled back into his life with Cooper. The heart attack had been a wake-up call, a reminder that time was precious and finite. Jack made every day count. He took more photos, documenting Cooper's life. He wrote stories about their adventures, which his granddaughter compiled into a little book. He simply spent time being present, appreciating this relationship that had brought meaning back to his life. Cooper thrived under Jack's constant attention. His leg was never going to be perfect, but he moved around the paddock contentedly, secure in the knowledge that his person wasn't going anywhere. The depression that had gripped him during Jack's absence never returned. He'd found his place, his purpose, his person. On warm afternoons, Jack would bring his chair into the paddock and simply sit while Cooper grazed nearby. Sometimes Jack would doze off, and Cooper would position himself close by as if standing guard. When Jack woke, The first thing he'd see was Cooper's bulk, solid and reassuring, and he'd reach out to touch him to confirm he was real. "You know what, mate?" Jack said one evening as they watched the sunset together, his hand resting on Cooper's shoulder. "I spent my whole life around cattle, thousands of them over the years. But you're something special. You remind me that every animal is an individual with feelings and personality and the capacity for friendship. I'm grateful every day that I found you in that sale yard. Or maybe you found me. Either way, we're lucky, aren't we?" Cooper turned his head to look at Jack, his dark eyes soft and trusting, and released a gentle low that somehow sounded like agreement. In the golden light of evening, man and bull stood together, two discarded souls who'd found exactly what they needed in each other. Proof that family isn't always defined by species or blood, but by the bonds we choose to honor and the love we choose to give.